This morning. It's 7:30 and time for Freshly Press 981, where we give you detailed analysis of the news stories for today. I am Ayo Mairo Ese.
And I'm Valentine Ohu. Good morning.
Good morning. And all right, joining us this morning, it's a pleasure to welcome back after we haven't heard my first time meeting him, and for a number of people we haven't heard his voice in a while, Orji Uka. Good morning, Orji.
Welcome, Orji.
Thank you very much. Good to be back.
Good to have you back.
Good morning, Lagos.
Orji Uka is at Orji Uka on Twitter. We have our regulars, Nnamdi Awakalu at Nnamdi Eke on Twitter.
Hello.
Good to have you. I feel in the minority. We have very male voices here. Joining them, we have chxta. Morning, Cheta.
Good morning.
Thank you. That was kind. Always good to see
I wish
you.
to make a complaint.
No.
Cheta, I
No,
said
Cheta.
it's good to see you.
It's too early in the morning on a Monday.
Yes.
I came
No.
back on the last flight yesterday. We landed
I
at
did not put you on
midnight.
the
I'm
flight.
still grumpy.
It's fine.
All right. Okay.
You'll be
so
alright.
Cheta is at chxta, and I'm sure he'll be sharing with his Twitter family why he's so disgruntled this
Oh, by the way,
morning.
Orji, this is what you missed.
All right, let's go into our stories for today. We have some important stories to get through.
Yes. Please.
Now, if you'd like to join the conversation, remember you can go onto Twitter at smooth981fm and use the hashtag freshlypress981.
And also send us messages on WhatsApp 0809-444-0981. We're streaming live on YouTube and on Instagram. Join us and add to the conversation, please.
Thank you. All right, first story here. I'll go to you, Nnamdi, for this one. Federal government school feeding crisis cripples scheme benefiting states lament. This is an investigative piece by the Punch newspaper, worth reading, as with many of their investigative pieces. And it just talks about, it highlights the federal government school feeding program and talks about the teething problems that they're, battling with. I don't know if we should call this teething problems after 3 years, being in operation.
The
But
child
that's-
is old.
yeah, this is no longer teasing. Sorry.
Sorry.
This is more, this is not teasing. Oh, but they've mentioned a few things. So please kindly take us to this story.
It's nice to see that the Punch newspaper is no longer pulling its punches, so to speak.
To be fair to them, they've not been pulling their punches for about 3 years.
No, but now, the gloves are completely off.
Oh, absolutely,
They're
yeah.
boxing bare knuckle at the moment.
Mhm.
But, this story is quite a long one, because obviously it addresses an issue that was, I think this was one of the centerpieces of this government's mandate when they first came into power.
Yes, very true.
It was instituted in 2016 after much hue and cry about how long it had taken for them to finally bring it on board. Sorry, Lagos, I have a bit of a cold, so
Sorry.
I sound even deeper than usual.
It's
I
okay.
was looking for the right
It's a
word.
nice voice to listen to on a Monday morning. Go
Oh,
on.
why? Thank you, Ayo.
You're welcome. Go on.
Anyway, so they've pulled out these records to show that initially they started with certain numbers in certain states and cities and areas, and unfortunately they're now operating at well below capacity. So in some cases, like in Enugu State, you
Yeah.
have 413 schools left out of 1,204 that were initially earmarked for the program. Now, at the launch of the homegrown school feeding program, we all know the vice president, obviously on behalf of the president and the entire government, promised that they would provide free school meals.
Yeah.
I suppose this is in public schools.
Yeah.
And
public-
unfortunately, over time, those numbers have dwindled. So I went through the story, and I think the common thread is that there have been occasions of fraud. That's what the government is saying. So, strangely enough, they claim that now that there are cooks who are supposed to be cooking these meals who have flawed credentials, and so they've had to take those cooks out of the programs.
Yeah.
So, according to this story, the number of cooks determines how many students are being fed,
Yeah.
which is a little strange to me. I would think that if you have cooks that have flawed credentials or for whatever reason are no longer able to perform the duties they were hired for, you simply replace them.
Mhm.
But it sounds like these students and these schools that have been left out of the scheme, it's been going on for a while, and the only available information as to why that has stopped is that they don't have enough cooks, which which is, I mean,
Sounds
it
ludicrous.
doesn't bear listening to.
Yeah,
In some other cases, you have some areas where they claim the road is swampy,
yeah.
so officials are unable to get to
So not
the schools
accessible.
in some parts of Akwa Ibom, for instance. Once again, I would think that you knew this in the beginning when you were making the promises,
But did
when
they?
you took a year to put the scheme together. Shouldn't be a surprise.
That's the question I want to ask. Did they know this? The reason, even though it sounds like an obvious question, the reason I'm asking this is that many times, or oftentimes, we've accused the government of not doing their due diligence in terms of investigation, assessment before going or embarking on a project. Is this what has happened? When you're doing an intervention program, you have to go and investigate just how possible and how sustainable it is. One of the things that have been highlighted in this investigation is that it's not sustainable.
Yes.
It started in some places,
They
couldn't
were
continue
told
anymore.
before it started that it will not be sustainable. Simple
Exactly.
and short. The first problem is that money no day. Second problem is that it's some of these things are the most basic things. Everywhere the world over, government has been proven time and again to be an inefficient allocator of resources. Premium Times did an investigation of this school feeding program towards the end of last year, and they found that it was only in parts of Adamawa State and Kano State that this thing was working properly. Everywhere else there were
It
problems.
wasn't working.
Even worse, what they're now saying is that recently they had officials go to the schools to do a head count of students to determine whether, of course, as Cheta has pointed out, they were allocating their resources efficiently. And eventually they came out and determined that there were maybe in some cases half of the students initially reported that were actually turning up in school. Now, somebody else, I'm just trying not to quote too many names, but somebody else along the line in the story pointed out that if you do a head count in a school, you're not necessarily going to get a figure of exactly how many students are there, because for one reason or the other, some students may not turn up on the day you do a head count. It's an inefficient way of assessing whom you're supposed to be allocating the resources.
I'll
So
take
the
that
entire thing
keyword.
is fraught with
I'll take the keyword
misdirection,
you
if you
just
ask me.
mentioned, inefficiency. It's an inefficient process, as we've learned from this piece. So many questions, but we have to move on. But thank you very much, Nnamdi.
Very well.
Cheta, I'll go to the next story. SSS questions Sowore, but before then, I think we have comments, but let me tell you the headline. SSS questions Sowore for alleged links to Boko Haram, Shiite movement, IPOB. Premium Time support.
Before that story, Am I from Akoka reacts to the initial one. He says, so the cookie crumbles. I've always had issues with the government's socialist approach to free market policy. Starting is never an issue, but sustainability is the major key. Punch is not handling this with kids' gloves shop. Is that Ubamachido says, I still want to be bothered. We're bothered by the feeding program has practically come to a stop. The reasons are not far-fetched. The president's second term has to be one. Why continue with the program? Or has been one, so why continue?
All right, thank you. So, Cheta, back to the story on the SSS questioning Sowore for alleged links to Boko Haram. I won't go in, going into the details, but I'll ask you to just give your thoughts on this, please.
Well, I mean, probably with a few slaps, probably being a few slaps here and there, all of that. See, it's the classic vintage Nigerian security thing. You have somebody they are now holding him illegally, and they want to justify keeping him. So they're trying to force him to confess to anything, throwing his kitchen sink and more at him. I mean, it's crap, frankly, and it's a waste of everybody's time. The only group of all the groups that have been mentioned here, it was mentioned Boko Haram, it was mentioned Shiites, it was mentioned IPOB. These are groups that are all diametrically opposed to each other. And then suddenly this Sowore is one superstar mastermind criminal that will link all of them. How? The only group that Sowore has a tangential connection with is the fact that in July of this year, he met with Nnamdi Eke in New York. Both of them had a meeting to discuss about what did they talk about? What was it? About Nigerian government's malfeasance. That was the way they put it. Otherwise, his track record before that, with Nnamdi Eke specifically, was diametrically opposed. What do you call it? That thing was at best a meeting of convenience. Two people who opposed to each other, but suddenly found themselves having a common adversary. There's no evidence, as far as I know, of any transfer of knowledge or cash or skills between him or any of the groups. These guys are just trying to avoid the issue, which is how they embarrassed themselves and the whole country in front of the world and were daft enough to let it get filmed. That's what they are trying to avoid. They are, and it's just that classic thing of, oh, okay, I arrested you for wandering. I don't release you. So Mama Sekira's daughter was beaten up. I will accuse you of it. That kind of stuff. That is what they are doing. And it just is a window into how our security agencies work and an explanation of why they never seem to be able to sort anything out.
All right, thank you. It's important to note in this report that Iniebe Ifeanyi, who is one of the lawyers representing Sowore, said that in the first initial investigation, they tried to pin this on him and they had found nothing substantial for which to charge Mr. Sowore.
Tomorrow they will say that he's sponsoring headsmen.
All right, but they haven't. Just
I said tomorrow.
All right. Okay, let's move on to our next story. Thank you very much, Cheta. Orji, I'll come to you for this one. New Senate bill takes road maintenance from federal government. Interesting piece here from the Daily Times. That they're planning, that the Senate bill is planning to take road maintenance from the federal government and now have it to local and foreign investors, as they'll take it more seriously, seeing that they can, recoup their money from it. Please, can we analyze this story? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm happy you find the story interesting. I find it curious myself. So I just take the what, why, and how of the story. So what's, like you already pointed out, is that they want to take away not just maintenance of roads, as you mentioned, but also construction, rehabilitation, and maintenance away from federal government. When I first saw the story, I said, okay, are they taking it from federal government to the state governments or to the local governments? Lo and behold, the story says they want to take it and hand over to local and foreign investors. Now, why? So the reason is that according to them, federal government, I'm quoting them now, quoting the story, federal government had over the years failed to find solutions to the deplorable roads, state of Nigerian roads. Again, the Senate was convinced that the federal government was incapable of fixing the nation's roads with the funds from the yearly budget. So the federal government is incapable of doing a responsibility which is theirs. So what you do is to hand it over to local and foreign investors. Secondly, the story also mentioned that one of the reasons why FEMA has not succeeded is because the Petroleum Products Price Regulatory Agency (PDPRA) is supposed to remit 5% of its pump price template to FEMA. They have failed to do that. So if they have failed to do that, according to them, the total unlimited funds up to date is about 870 billion. If they have failed to do that, so what's the correlation between FEMA failing and PPRA failing to remit their what they're supposed to remit to FEMA and bringing local and foreign investors? If you're bringing local and foreign investors, are you now giving them the responsibility because it is theirs? Is it now an obligation on their part, or are you? Because the story does.
How will this process be managed?
It's just funny. According to them, let me quote it again. This Senator Geshon Bassi from Cross River State, someone like you I met before. He says there is no rocket science here. This idea has been working in other parts of the world and it cannot be different in Nigeria. Money will automatically flow into our roads because the private sector will be willing and ready to invest since they know it's a thriving business. We're just a funny set of people.
I would like to ask the question, I don't know if you have it, but just to ask in case you do, which countries around the world has this worked, whereby we now hand over the responsibility of infrastructure of the nation to private and local, to local and foreign investors?
To be fair, in a number of countries, they have serious public-private partnership agreements. Even in Nigeria, I believe we have a few of them. But the truth is that our governments, and I'm not talking about this particular government, over the years have proven to be against sanctity of contracts. They enter into contract with private investors. They would breach that, whether it's local or foreign investors. Our history is replete with cases where we enter into contract with people, and then when we realize they're making too much money or something, we just find a way to put an end to it. Nigerian governments break contract because they don't like the face of the investor. I don't see how it's going to be different. For me, this their deal is a joke.
Okay, thank you very much, Orji.
Let's go to the next story. I'll come to you, Nnamdi, for this one. From this day newspaper, worker strike cuts power supply to 2,828 megawatts. This report from the Office of the Vice President stated that the strike that we experienced on last Thursday brought the country's supply to an all-time low. It's just yesterday that many people in Lagos started experiencing almost consistent power supply. But looking through the story, what's your take on it?
All right, so I mean, like you mentioned, we all recall what happened last week. I think for about 24 hours, it was something like a nationwide blackout, which was wild because even though we're very used to the lack of electricity in this country, it was still crazy to find that not just you, but your neighbor and your neighbor's neighbor, and people in the next state, everyone sort of is
Equal.
experiencing the same sort of issues. Now, what this story is trying to do is to give an explanation that I think the main issue is that the General Secretary of the National Union of Electricity Employees told media that the strike was occasioned by the non-payment of entitlement of over 2,000 workers of the defunct PHCN. Anyone who's been keeping up with the Nigerian power sector knows that PHCN was unbundled sometime during the Jonathan era to make way for what you now have, which is a transmission company, which is power controlled by the government. You have generation companies, you have distribution companies, and there's a whole supply chain that holds them all together. So he's saying that I'm guessing that they were laid off during privatization. What is this now? 14? When did the process begin?
It ended in 2014.
There you go. So now we're talking about 5 years ago. It must be. Yes, they haven't been paid. So you can understand. I guess this is where I'm trying to drive to. You can have some compassion for the strike. It doesn't give any explanation how the failure to pay 2,000 workers crippled the entire.
It does when you have a highly centralized grid. But personally, I feel that this whole speech from the OVP is just window dressing. They had 21 days from the day the NUEE gave the ultimatum within which to act. Last week, the vice president chaired the Federal Executive Council meeting the day before the strike. They didn't discuss it. Suddenly, the thing happened, and then to say, oh, 28 megawatts is the lowest we've ever generated. That's hogwash. The national grid has collapsed 11 times this year. In short, Saturday was number 12. It collapsed again on Saturday. So what are we talking about? See, as long as, and this goes into the previous story that Orji was talking about road maintenance, the problem is that the Nigerian government does not want to let go of anything. They want to control everything. They don't have the capacity to control anything, but they want to control everything. So as long as we have that lacuna, we'll keep seeing nonsense like this. End of story.
All right, thanks, Cheta. We have Uboma Chinuzi who says, with the type of ridiculous bills coming out of the Senate, I have this takeover of road construction by the Senate. I find it laughable. Oh wait, is Saraki still president? I thought it was a problem of this administration. All right, okay.
Very, very funny.
Thank you, Boma.
We have messages here. Lukman from Bagada says PPP is in government circles mean handing over handing over common resources to cronies of people in government. NITEL, NEPA, many more. Most often, their people do not have the means to sustain the businesses and end up relying on their friends in the government to provide bailouts. The Senate will do us all a favor and stipulate in the law that anyone found to have ties with anyone in the government be hauled.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to our next story. Orji, I'll come back to you. We have this story here that border closure not breaching free trade agreement, says the federal government, Daily Times. Now, this conversation has come up a number of times. Recently, we signed up to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and also, of course, we are members of ECOWAS, and we have agreements for free movement of goods and services across countries, at least in West Africa for now, before AFCTFA kicks in next year. However, we have this report coming in from the Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development, the Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development, Sabo Nanono, who says that free trade does not mean Nigeria has to be a dumping ground for everything imported by others. The article lists why he thinks that Nigeria had become a dumping ground before this border closure. Please take us through the story.
Okay, just a straightforward answer. I do not agree with him.
Okay.
The interesting thing, when I saw the headline, everyone thought it was the African.
Yeah, I thought so too. Yeah.
Reading further, he was restricting what he was saying to West African, so which is ECOWAS, and the politics of it. Yeah. To answer the question, the border closure not only breaches the ECOWAS agreement, it also breaches the spirit of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I'm saying so because, like you rightly pointed out, it's only in 2020 that the agreement will become operational.
Yeah.
And the other thing that Nigeria is even yet to ratify it. We've only signed it under the law we practice in Nigeria, some other people need to do it that way. Once you sign an agreement, international agreement, it becomes effective immediately. But for Nigeria, we need the National Assembly to ratify it, to domesticate it, as we like to say. So for now, it does not breach that agreement because we've not it's not become operational as far as Nigeria is concerned. But in terms of the spirit, not just the ECOWAS agreement, but the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, what is really dealing with, and this is something I also think I should point out. The end, that agreement that we've already signed is not the end. The end is what they have called Agenda 2063, which would essentially have an African continental
free trade area,
the way you have in the EU.
Yeah.
When that happens, it means there will be no borders, or at least you will not have hard borders, as they say. So the agreement is clearly against it. Nigeria had opposition, if you remember, to the signing of the agreement.
Yes.
We talked about all this dumping and all of those things. To be fair, those were legitimate concerns.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, the government, not me, decided to sign it. So the moment you sign an agreement, you must comply with the terms of that agreement. Do it properly.
It goes back to what you talked about, not honoring.
No, we don't have respect for agreement. There's something interesting here. The minister says in the southern part of the country, which is where I come from, people no longer eat foreign rice. Say people do not eat foreign rice anymore. In Ebonyi and Abakaliki, you can hardly see anybody selling foreign rice. I don't know if it's that absolute. That's first.
No, it's not.
He also now goes further to say that, which is why what I find funny, that in Kano State, when he visited some rice millers in Ukura in Kano State, he realizes that very soon Nigeria will start exporting rice. Now, the essence of Nigeria will ban import of rice, but start exporting. Are you dealing with people who are fools? You ban importation of rice into your country, but you hope to export rice into another person's country. If all the countries in Africa and the rest of the world decide to start breaching agreements like that, it's chaos that's going to lead to. That's why I said, look at the politics of it. The agreement is in breach. They should find a way to resolve it in a way that we are still in compliance with the agreement and still protect our local industries.
Thank you.
Remember just last week, our president, sorry, Cheta, before you link to that, last week the president made an announcement at a session, announcing, visa for all Africans coming into the country, and also linking it with this story. And isn't it evident that we were not ready as a country for these agreements to be signed? Because that's the blockage of the border.
We are not ready, period.
End of story.
For anything.
Wow.
I also think it bears saying that just this atmosphere of protectionism that we seem to have around our economy does not make for the greatest atmosphere for the investors that people are constantly talking about.
Very true.
Do you understand? We're not China. Even though people will continue to point to China and protectionism, we're not China. We're not a
China
major
didn't
player.
even do it.
They actually
When
China
they did
opened
it,
their
it was
borders
a
before.
disaster.
There you go. But I'm saying, that's constantly being pointed to. Oh, look around the world.
True.
They're doing
It's
this
an
and
easy
doing that.
example that people give.
But Nigeria is not in that position at all.
All right.
Thank
you.
Cheta, I'll come to you for this next story. Boko Haram kills 19 Fulani herdsmen. That's according to this headline from Thisday newspaper. It might read as it's an interesting story because when you at first read, you think it's a good thing, but it's terrible. What does this story tell you?
Why I don't understand why you say at first you think it's a good thing, because it shows that you don't quite get the dynamics of what has been happening around there. Okay, so first things first, the Nigerian military has changed strategy in the areas, basically a line north of the town. They've adopted this super fortress strategy where the military essentially withdraws into certain towns and fortifies those places and calls them those are there. Then they abandon the countryside effectively to especially the ISWAP faction. So what the ISWAP faction has been doing is that they've been digging in and consolidating, and the locals in the rural areas that have been abandoned by the military they've been taxing them. So these headsmen, they went to demand tributes, taxation, the old way of we want give us some of your cows or pay us in lieu, that kind of stuff. The headsmen decided to go and to do some vengeance, and Boko Haram, who were heavily armed, who were better armed than they were, killed 19 of them. That's what happened. That's tragic because these headsmen were only trying to protect their own property.
Yes.
So essentially what it tells me is that property in those areas are no longer safe. they essentially belong to ISWAP. It's the ISWAP faction that is responsible for this. And the sooner we admit that, okay, we have lost the initiative and that this thing has reached a sort of uneasy equilibrium or stalemate, then the sooner we admit that, instead of all this, oh, technically defeated, oh, this, then we will know what to do. But what is happening is that ISWAP especially are in the early stages of state formation. State formation is when somebody is in a position to demand an exact tribute from vassal subjects in that area that he controls. Another word for tribute, taxes.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Cheta, for your analysis.
Cheta, isn't this story a little funny? Because on the one hand, it says that there are 19 cattle herders. On the other hand, it says they are Fulani herdsmen. I think that's what Val was referring to. It's like, okay, Fulani herdsmen, we know they're a current scourge. Some people murdered Fulani herdsmen.
The blanket description that's used.
Exactly, but it doesn't appear that they are actually herdsmen in the terrorist sense.
Yes, so
that
that is where people have always got it wrong. So the herdsmen who have been terrorizing large swaths of the Middle Belt and the Northwest are largely Fulani. But then there are other herdsmen, also Fulani, who have also been victims of those guys. So when you say Fulani herdsmen, you risk blanketing everyone.
That's right.
So some Fulani herdsmen, it's kind of like saying when people say, oh, IPOB. There are people who, I have been called an IPOB supporter simply because I'm Igbo. You understand? It's the same ballpark.
Yeah.
Yes, the people who have been doing nonsense are Fulani herdsmen, but not all Fulani herdsmen. I've talked about this before. It comes to that whole Nigerian thing of assigning collective guilt. When if somebody slaps Ayo now, suddenly myself, Nnamdi, and Orji are guilty because we're all equal. You know, that's Nigerian thing that we need to unlearn a lot in this country.
And that's how skewed the narrative has been. Thank you very much, Cheta. Thank you, Nnamdi. Nnamdi, I'll come to you for this, your analysis on this story. Sorry, Orji, this would be you. New Telegraph reports that senators, it's been revealed according to Independent Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Commission, the alleged diversion of billions of naira allocated for the intervention projects, otherwise known as constituency projects in time past. Over the years, recently we talked about how they put a figure that over 10 years that a lot of money has been allocated for the same reason, but no verifiable property or installation has been seen.
Okay, so because of time, I'll just take a few seconds to mention that for me the problem is constitutional. I can't wrap my head around how members of National Assembly are allowed to implement or execute the law.
Yeah.
So when you have a budget, at best, just National Assembly members should attract, say, development projects to their constituencies, but then nominate an agency of the federal government, the executive arm of government, to implement or execute it. That is actually how it's supposed to be done. Not to allow them, because for senators and reps to be in a position to divert funds, it will mean that the money is going to them, which is wrong. So, and as long as we continue to do that, the problem will not be resolved.
Thank you.
The other part of the story which I can get into about Smedan, but the sugar really done.
Thank you very much. And just as a means of mention, Nnamdi, if Punch newspaper reports that NECO probes workers with fake certificates, they did a verification and found that a lot of their workers have forged documents. Your thoughts?
Again, for time, let's just keep it brief. It's a wild one. You have officials at NECO, which is an organization that is supposed to issue certificates.
National Examinations Council.
And then they're there with false credentials. You know, it's probably one of the longest running ironies in Nigeria that those who are required to supervise and look out for others are themselves in need of extra supervision, if you like. So yeah, it's not that surprising, I don't think, to a lot of Nigerians, but the numbers are a little concerning, where they're saying that 70 of NECO's workers were dismissed. I mean, some of them were dismissed on the spot. I don't see much about a hearing, but that happened on November 15th. 70 of the workers were asked to quit immediately for certificate 4.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you,
much.
Nnamdi. Thank you so much to our analysts. You guys have, I mean, you men have been wonderful. Thank you, Orji, Orji Uka. Because we have a
Careful now. Careful now.
Orji Uka is at Orji Uka on Twitter. Nnamdi is at Nnamdi Eke on Twitter. And Cheta is at chxta on Twitter. Please engage them further beyond this conversation. We continue tomorrow morning. Use the hashtag freshlypressed981. Don't go anywhere. At 8:15, we have sports with Tega in the locker room, 981.
The headlines. The story.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.